Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of
Kero.
My name is Hans.
I'm Edward.
And we are your hosts for a third year in a row.
Hey, woo, crowd goes wild.
Welcome to 2022 and our first episode of the year. We hope that you've all had a restful holiday season, and we hope that you will continue to enjoy our episodes on a weekly basis. So for today's episode, we're going to be looking at narratives and lore within video games. Aren't we, Edward?
Yeah.
So
and how it sometimes sucks.
Yes. Thank you. So this interesting topic sort of popped up while I was playing Halo Infinite. Absolutely exceptional game. The gameplay really sells it this time around. But as always in typical Halo fashion, it has the most incredible lore, but you're always only given the smallest sliver when you play the video game. And so Edward and I were talking about this, and we were like, well, that's a rather interesting notion of how, if you think of narratives today, right? And what exactly is a narrative? A narrative, it's a spoken or a written account of connected events. So it's basically a story. So when you think of narratives today, or the really, really good narratives, we know that whether it's in cinema or movies or even in video games, a very good narrative will give you, the reader, viewer, gamer, everything you need to fully feel, satisfied.
Immersed.
Yes, immersed and satisfied with whatever it is you're consuming without you having to wonder about certain things. Like, why wasn't this discussed? Or what happened to this plot point that they just never went back to, So it's something we feel quite strongly about. I myself am someone who adores narrative. I gravitate towards things that, that I feel are engrossing, and they pull me into the world, and they do a good enough job of explaining everything without me needing to go to external sources to find more information.
Yeah. And
that is something that Edward and I have come to realize is actually a huge problem with video games. Not all video games, I might say, but a majority of them, whereby you will have a good, engaging narrative, but it will allude to things that are not present in the narrative or just not explained unless you do extra exploration. And then you find audio logs or books or notes or maybe a side quest that has more information to do with the narrative. Things that if you don't explore, you will miss.
Yeah.
And that then leads to the point of why are video games so inclined on adding lore as extras to find versus trying to make an all-encompassing and engaging narrative that gives you everything you need without needing extras?
Well, I think that the main point we should recognize is that not all video games are RPGs. If they were, let's say, Horizon Zero Dawn, for instance, it's incredibly written, and the lore you can find is just as incredible. And there are a million things that you can find. There are audio notes, there are written notes, there are collectibles that have their own notes.
Look, of course it's subjective, right? Like nobody wants lore or narrative from Tetris. Well, I say that, but I would love a Tetris story mode.
That's exactly like I would love the origins of Tetris.
Where did the blocks come from? What do they mean? Why are they different colors? Why do they intersect the way they do? Anyway, no, but that's...
EA, get on that. The thing is, when it comes to a game like Halo, okay, it's one... It's a funny thing to me because I believe that as long as you can play the game, the series, and understand things that happen in the series, that's fine. But then you get like allusions to stuff like the Endless. You and I just spoke about this.
Yes,
and the Forerunners.
what Edward is referring to here, and this leads to, I suppose, the bigger the issue with lore in video games versus other media, right? So the way that I look at it is, why do video games get a pass in terms of lore and narrative versus things like TV series and movies? In this respect, I mean, if you go and watch a movie and the narrative is full of plot holes and things don't get spoken about and stuff is not answered, more often than not, you'll come away from that film being like, that was a bit of a waste of time, or rather, if you look at adaptations, and most of the time adaptations will leave a lot on the cutting room floor purely because it's very difficult to adapt internal monologues, especially coming from books.
Yeah.
However, a lot of them are done well. The Harry Potter franchise is one of the most successful in that regard. But then there are things like Eragon, which are absolutely terrible because they cut so much out of the film that you just didn't know what was actually going on in terms of the movie. So when I looked at it like that and I thought about it for a moment, I realized that it's because gaming is an interactive medium. So, gamers have the ability to explore and find things. The issue with that, however, is how that has become a normal means of finding additional story or means of plugging in holes within a narrative. And to me, that's not good enough. Because if you have a slice of a narrative that appeases, okay, fine, a majority of people who play, but then you have more interesting tidbits that fully flesh out this narrative hidden around the game world, it means that a large majority of people who consume the content are not going to get the full story. And that is a little bit of a problem, in my opinion, because I've noticed in particular, and I don't want to be dragging Halo under this bus, it's just the most recent game that I've played and the most recent one that is on my mind, which is why it's easy for me to pull on it for examples, is how as the series developed over the years, you would have one installment, let's say 5, and then Infinite comes around. But then there's a whole 18-month gap between the two games, which the core narrative doesn't discuss. But if you do side quests and go and look for lore dumps, you will find the information that, in my opinion, should have been given from the get-go.
Yeah.
So that would be, I think, not my argument per se, but why this is why I think it's so interesting that games get away with this just because they're an interactive medium. But I'm of the opinion that shouldn't be the case. That should be the edge case. In other words, I'm of the opinion that we should have The Last of Us styled narratives, or as you mentioned now, Horizon Forbidden.
Horizon Zero Dawn.
Sorry, I'm confused. The new one is
on the mind.
The new one. Yeah, I have the new one on the mind. So in that circumstance, and as Edward is saying, the game has an exceptional narrative. Even God of War, there's enough in these titles where you don't end up. I mean, you always end up wondering. It's part and parcel of every narrative. Is what else could there be? But what's nice about these narratives is that they're so self-contained enough. You don't need additional lore dumps or extras around the worlds to flesh out the main narrative, the core narrative.
Yeah. On top of that, though, is let's look at franchises like Mass Effect. Okay, both Mass Effect 1 and 2 are amazing. You get all the story given to you, and if you really want, you can go and search for it even more, like background stuff, which you don't need, but it helps. Okay,
if you're so inclined, right?
Mass Effect 3 comes along, yes, but then Mass Effect 3 comes along, and that does the bad thing. Mass Effect 3, sure, it explains what happens in the gap, so that's fine, and it's still a self-contained story. But it has elements in it, such as the character Kai Ling, such as the backstory of some villains that you meet throughout the story, minor villains, but still. This relies on comic books and literal novels to make you understand who they are and what they are doing there. And stuff like that. That's a really bad thing. So it's one thing to exclude some narrative and just have the player follow one story, such as, let's say, Infinite with 16 months. I think it's 16 months of you don't know what happened then. But it's an entirely different thing to tell players that, oh, you can get the 16-month info if you read the book. And that's a different kind of assholery that I have an issue with.
So what Edward is in particular talking about here is Halo is one of the few video game franchises, but not the only one, that actually contains lore and narrative that is canon to the overarching story in media outside of the video games.
Yeah.
Now, that in itself is not too much of an issue, right? Because it's okay for universes to expand. Like we know with the recent acquisition of Bungie by Sony, they actually want to expand the franchises that Bungie owns into other forms of entertainment media, which could be books, it could be movies, it could be TV series. Whether all of that is linked into one core universe is another story altogether. Much like how the new Halo TV series apparently is going to be on its own timeline and it's not going to be canon to the video games. That's actually a discussion for another day, I presume.
Yeah, it's completely different.
I just realized that would actually make for a very good discussion, but we can talk about that in a future episode. Yeah. So rather what this episode is about is, how important are narrative lore elements to video games? So as we've discussed, contrary to other forms of media, video games are interactive. So through that method of being interactive, the ability to explore worlds in greater detail exists versus something like TV shows or movies, whereby what you watch is what you get and that's it. A game, on the other hand, allows you to explore this beautiful world that you've watched or you've learned so much about and maybe gain more information about it. So what I would say from that perspective is the importance of lore in that respect is fine if it fleshes out an already good core narrative. Yes. My issue comes from the fact where a lot of games today are doing this, and the Far Cry series is one example, as far as I can understand. Is yes, you have a great and engaging core narrative, but they leave so much left to discovery and exploration. Actually, sorry, I meant Assassin's Creed, not necessarily Far Cry.
Far Cry works.
But they're both guilty of it, I suppose.
Yeah.
It's not. I mean, their core narratives are good enough. They're good enough. They're satisfying in their own respects. But like in Assassin's Creed, for example, the Isu are seldom spoken about. Now they're the gods behind everything. These ancient beings,
the Forerunners,
like the Forerunners in Halo, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that's actually so interesting because Halo does this with the Forerunners as well. So anyway, in these titles, if you want to find out more about these incredible beings or their histories and so on and so forth, it's always in lore dumps that are within the world and you need to find them. So it's very seldom ever told to you directly within the core narrative. Now, the issue with that for me is how a lot of this stuff is actually incredibly interesting. And as I've mentioned before, a lot of it often will come back in sequels or in future titles, and they'll unknowingly be referenced. And the thing is, if you didn't pick up on that in one of the original titles, you will miss out on it completely. And that then becomes the bigger problem with video games lore narrative and why lore elements are more important than I think many studios are giving them credit. As in, I think a lot of the times games are focused on, the gameplay versus actually being focused on the narrative. I mean, obviously, I suppose because it's a game, the gameplay is important and so on and so forth, right? Of course, there are certain games like Detroit Become Human, which do focus more on the story than they do on the gameplay. But those are rare. They're few and far between, and they're often criticized for their lack of gameplay.
So much so they're called interactive movies.
Yes. So I suppose that's where that fine line comes in. But I suppose what my point that I'm trying to get across, right, is I'm all for additional lore in video games. I just don't want that lore to be something that is excluded from the core narrative when it should be included. So what I will say in this regard is I would maybe take my hat off to a lot of properties on PlayStation and with Sony, whereby games like Horizon, God of War, Uncharted, they all have truly exceptional, well self-contained core narratives that don't need additional lore dumps, whether that's in finding an artifact here or a note there or a scroll somewhere else. You can thoroughly enjoy those stories to their maximum without worrying that you've missed something else. Rather, the way that they work is their lore are nice to haves, the wonderful cherries on the top of a delicious core narrative. You see? But now not all games are like that. I would say even fewer games manage to do that correctly.
Yeah. Like, as you were saying that, I was thinking, it's actually funny how a game like Mortal Kombat, as convoluted as that story is, you always get all the story in all the games. Like, every single game has all the story. It gives you everything it possibly exists in the world. So it's weird that a fighting game like Mortal Kombat sometimes gives you everything, whereas a game such as, let's say, Splinter Cell, because even that is super guilty of not giving you everything.
Yes.
Which is a solo game, a solo player game. Obviously, it can be played multiplayer, but that's beside the point. It just doesn't give you everything, and that's the big issue. It's one thing to play something like Skyrim, which already has a huge open world to explore with all its lore. And then you get the tie-in novels. And unlike, let's say, unlike Splinter Cell again, where they say, okay, but you need to kind of read this book to understand what's going on in this particular mission. In Skyrim, the only two books that ever existed in the Elder Scrolls universe are so completely removed from the games at hand. You don't need to read them at all if you're not interested.
You see, so what's interesting about what you've said now, and I didn't know that about Splinter Cell. That's actually quite interesting. It's my biggest irk with Halo. And the only reason why I feel this way is because I'm a fan. I've been there since the beginning, and the lore of the game is so incredible. There's so much there to unpack. And I just feel that it's a shame that it's not done as well as I believe it could be for the gamers. Now, of course, I suppose the reasoning behind this, and it's not entirely the fault of 343. I think it's just the way the game is designed. And that is because you always solely focus on Master Chief's story. It's just Master Chief, what he is currently doing at that moment in time. And because of that, I suppose, to an extent, you are limited in terms of the story you can tell. So in the gap that we were talking about just now, there's like an 18-month gap between Halo 5 and Halo Infinite. In that gap, Master Chief is in cryostasis. So there is no story for Chief to tell. However, there is a book that completely fleshes out exactly what happens between Halo 5 and Halo Infinite. But how many people are going to read that? Unless you're a major fan of the series. So to me, as a fan of the greater lore, I would love for that to be explained further. But then I suppose in a certain way, it takes away from Master Chief, because Halo is meant to be his story. It's not meant to be the story of everything else that goes on around the Halo.
See, but that's the beauty of a franchise like Halo. It's sure you're playing MCU's story, and maybe the games are meant to be his story, fine. But then this world is beyond unbelievable.
Yeah, it really is.
I wasn't a big Halo fan. I'm still not really. But since you and I have been speaking, I have been going down rabbit holes.
Mm-hmm.
One rabbit hole here, one rabbit hole there. I've been watching Let's Plays. I'm on Halo 4 now. And I have slowly become engrossed in this damn world. And it's actually sad that even between Halo 3 and 4, the gap is not as bad. But in 4, they do something new, which is they give you new protagonists to follow.
Yeah.
And I'm
Blue
like,
team,
but
right?
why?
Blue team and or
I'm at a
it
loss
doesn't
for
matter.
words now. I
Doesn't matter.
forgot. But yeah. But you see these guys, okay, and you're like, wow, I would have loved to know more about them. And then you think back about Halo 3, and Halo 3 is so isolated, which makes total sense. But why in Halo 3 could you not find extra bits then? So in that regard, I would have loved to see extra bits found, which is only that exists only in the books. There are like 28 books already out for Halo. I think an entire trilogy of books is just about Halo 4.
Correct. Correct. So look, I understand, the possible need for expanding on these universes in different mediums and so on and so forth. I just feel that it shouldn't take away or be missing from the core franchise. Yeah. So I'm all for, like, take what you've said, for example, now, right? You want to know more about that team. What's interesting about what you've said is that you can learn more about that team. You just have to get the book.
Yes.
Which is my issue with how lore is often dealt with in video games. Imagine going to a movie now. Just imagine this, right? Imagine going to a movie, watching the movie. There's a subplot, and then it just stops. And then after the movie ends, you're told, no, you got to go and buy this book and read it. That movie would be canned at the box office.
Yeah.
So,
like a good example now, but back to movies as well. Yeah. A good example. No, you know how lately we don't get origin stories. It's like Spider-Man and Batman. We don't see. That's
because they're done so much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But imagine now the very first Batman movie or the very first Spider-Man movie. We don't see them become Batman or Spider-Man. We only see them, oh shit, they're fighting crime. If we got Spider-Man Homecoming at the very beginning, people would ban that shit because they wouldn't know why Spider-Man is Spider-Man. If we got Batman, I forgot the previous one where we
the
only
Christian
see
Bale
a glimpse.
Or Batfleck?
No, Batfleck. Dawn of Justice. That's the name. If we got that and only saw a glimpse of this guy's dad and mom die in an alley, we would ask, where's the rest?
Martha.
Yeah, Martha. Why you say that name?
Yes.
We would ask why. Why does this matter? And that's the same for Halo, especially Halo 4 now.
Look,
which is why do I have to care about these guys?
The last thing I wanted to do was make this a Halo bashing thing, which I don't believe this discussion is. It's just more so. It's just one of the worst offenders. Let's be honest about it. I love the franchise, I love the games, but it's one of the worst offenders in this regard in terms of narrative.
Plus, it's the freshest on the mind at the moment.
Correct. One interesting thing I did want to bring up now is, I know I mentioned previously, I suppose maybe this is where a bit of, again, the difference is. So I mentioned it a bit early on in the episode where I suppose video games, to an extent, get this free pass because they're an interactive medium. So the ability exists within a 50-hour game, which only has like 4 hours of narrative, to find extra lore that maybe they didn't have time to put in, or whatever the case is, right? So we could make a variety of excuses and examples. What I want to say about that, though, is that sometimes it can work to have lore elsewhere.
Yeah.
And again, it depends on the game. So we've mentioned now that video games are very broad. It's not like a movie or a TV series where you go in knowing exactly what to expect, with the exception of the overarching content, or rather the genre of whatever it is you're watching. But overall, you know you're going to get a self-contained story that doesn't require you to go elsewhere to find something else in order to make what you're watching complete. Whereas video games are a little bit different. A game I really want to bring to mind in this regard is Apex Legends. So Apex, for those who may not know, is a battle royale title. Okay, it's developed by Respawn and EA, and it's all about like 60 to 90 people dropping into a match in teams of 3 or in teams of 2, and they all fight to be declared the winner. Now, every season of Apex, which is every 3 odd months, there's a new character that gets released, but there's also a new lore dump that gets released with each character. And what is truly fascinating about Apex is how this is a game that doesn't have a narrative. It doesn't need a narrative. That's not the point of the gameplay. You know, the gameplay is the same. Well, I say the same. Of course, it's always different because you need different strategies to win. But what I mean is it's effectively the same thing. It's not like a game like Halo where you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And depending on your actions throughout will determine what happens to the world or the people around you. And we can say that for all good games like The Last of Us, God of War. You know, there's many, many examples. I know those are the ones that are fresh to mind because I'm a huge narrative person. And that's the games that I gravitate towards, which is why I have those on my mind all the time. And what I want to say about that is, although Apex Legends is not a narrative-focused game, it has incredible lore and narrative. Sure, it's very much disjointed. And I suppose the reason for that is because there's no need to pull it all together. But even with that in mind, there is still some sort of an overarching thing. And I suppose maybe, once again, that illustrates the power of a video game versus something like movies and TV series, whereby you enjoy the gameplay of this game, but you don't need the lore to play it. But the lore is there if you so wish to be, to be immersed in it.
Yeah.
Now, I'm fine with games that are like that. Like I was saying, imagine Tetris being like Tetris that you played, but maybe on the side there's like little lore dumps, telling you about the aliens that invented Tetris. I don't know, just as a fun example, right? Now, I know we probably should have mentioned this at the start, but those are not the games we're talking about. We're talking about narrative-focused games that are missing out on narrative. And that's why we keep talking about things like Halo or Assassin's Creed or Far Cry or Splinter Cell.
Exactly. As you were speaking about Apex now, I was immediately thinking about Siege because that does it as well. Amazing
yes, you're right.
operating backgrounds, no story. Literally no story. On that topic though, Dota, I think it was Dota, or was it LOL? Anyway, that recently got
League of Legends with the show. With Arcane.
Which is incredible. And then also Unreal Tournament. Now, this is not a franchise you would think has any lore.
Just before we go into Unreal Tournament quickly, can we just speak about that for a second? The Arcane and League of Legends.
Yeah.
I find that fascinating because to me, that is an external lore drop that has nothing to do with the narrative.
Yeah, but it
works
so much.
So well. Now,
yes.
The reason why I'm just immediately wanting to talk about that is because I've recently just read some tidbits whereby the director of that Arcane TV series, which is excellent, by the way, has now been hired by Bungie, which is now owned by Sony. So there's a very, very good chance we might get like, if we get content like that, which is separate from the core narrative and doesn't need to be consumed to enjoy the main narrative, I'm all down for it. And I suppose that's why I'm in favor of what they're doing with the Halo TV series. But again, that's another discussion for another episode.
Yeah, that's an entirely different discussion. We can actually lump the Halo series with Arcane and all that and speak about that because I think it'll make it
Unreal
amazing.
Tournament, you were saying?
Anyway, before I digress my own thoughts. So Unreal Tournament did a weird thing, which is, I think it should be applauded, but it ended up being banned. Spoiler alert. You wouldn't think this franchise has any lore, but we got Unreal Tournament, we got Unreal Tournament 2K3, then we got 2K7, and eventually Unreal Tournament 3. So Unreal Tournament 3 did the weird thing of giving the game an actual narrative. It gave the world and everything, including the technology, why people can revive back to the start of the matches. It gave all of this backgrounds and explanations, and it actually gave the game a story as well. The main character was trying to rescue his sister, if I could remember correctly. And it wasn't a good game. I mean, the game didn't even get good scores. I would say it was unfairly
now
scores.
This is my question, right? What was the major criticism? Was it because it was a bad story or because it was bad gameplay?
It was the same gameplay as the previous ones. The major
So
criticism came
gameplay
of
was
the fact that
amazing, but it failed narratively.
Yeah, but it was also the only narrative we were ever given in Unreal Tournament. So for that alone, sure, it wasn't that great. It was a very cliched story. It was literally a rescue mission. You just go through all the Unreal Tournament game modes and maps in a randomly thrown together plot to get to the end and rescue the sister.
Okay.
But I love how they actually took the time, the developers, Epic, I guess, they took the time to flesh out every single character in the franchise. All the characters got a backstory.
Yeah.
All the characters got ample enough time in the game to explain themselves, to saw who they were.
You mean the actual narrative?
Yes, the actual plot now.
Okay.
They were all introduced as either bad guys or villains or gray area moral ethics. And you got a solid, isolated story from begin to end, while it explains all the technology and all the reasons why you need to capture flags, why you need to defend zones, why
that's
people
actually
can get
quite
revived.
interesting.
It did a very brave thing.
Okay.
And while the game was not good, I think it should be regarded as one of those games that actually tried to.
You mean maybe pioneered it a little bit?
Maybe, especially for that franchise, which now just died away.
Look, let's possibly also look at it from a bit of a different perspective, right? So perhaps the biggest issue here, but I personally believe this is changing. Okay, but let me first mention what it is that I'm thinking about before getting to my conclusion. Is video games are about gameplay. That is the gist of what it is to enjoy and to play video games, right?
Yeah.
It's why, in my personal opinion, Halo Infinite is probably the strongest title in the entire franchise. The gameplay is just superb. It's almost to the point where I can forgive the lackluster campaign. It's just the gameplay is so good. But is that enough? Is gameplay enough of a reason to give games a pass from a narrative lore perspective?
See, you would say so if you look at games like Quake Arena and Unreal Tournament and even Forza.
PUBG.
Because even PUBG, I mean...
I'll even throw Apex Legends in there. I know I spoke about there being lore dumps and that, but I know 99% of people don't read the comics, don't bother watching the lore videos that get released unless they're presented to you directly.
But now imagine a spin-off about Apex coming, which is a single-player adventure, or maybe even a co-op adventure.
I don't know how that would work, honestly. Unless
using all the backstory.
You see, I think there's too many characters for that. Unless they okay, now we're just spitballing, but
no, but you make it focused.
No, if it was a new character that isn't in the lore, in other words, this is a new character, and then throughout this character's adventure, they come across known characters from the battle royale. That I can understand, and the reason for that is because there's already 15 characters. You would almost need like 15 Origin games to make it work. Did you get what I'm saying? So So that's a bit different.
It's kind of like how Rainbow Siege Extraction now. They only use like 3 characters: Ash, I forgot the third one, and I forgot the other 2 as well. But anyway, 3 main characters, which is basically the story, and then you get 18 others that you can play as, and that's basically the story. Well, so you can do that for Apex. Anyway, we're digressing.
No, you see,
my entire point was to say that I just adore how our issues with the gaps that we need filled, Unreal Tournament 3 actually tried to do.
And it got panned for it.
And it got panned for it.
Okay, so this now, once again, let's go back to the question of this episode, or what this episode is focused about, and that is, how important are narrative lore elements to video games? It's a very nuanced answer, and that is because video games are unlike any other medium in the sense of they're interactive. and also depending on their genre, they may not need narrative at all or lore. Rather, what Edward and I have been trying to convey throughout this episode is how if a game is already narrative heavy or already contains a core narrative, then additional lore that fleshes out that canon narrative shouldn't be left to findables.
Yeah.
It should be explained adequately and enough to the gamer to not need to go and look for extra audio logs or books or scrolls, as I've said before. Rather, the self-contained core narrative should give you everything you need. However, if you are so inclined to explore, then you get those cherries on the top of maybe hints of what's to come, or maybe closing off a bit of a question somebody might have had from a loophole introduced in a previous narrative that might have been unintentional.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying?
Saying that, a game that immediately comes to mind is BioShock Infinite.
Oh, brilliant game. Love that game.
You wouldn't think in any of the BioShock games there are questions, okay? But the ending of Infinite.
Oh, so good.
Answers questions you never knew you had.
Yeah.
You know? That's amazing.
To me, you know what? I would say the BioShock Infinite way of doing things is I think BioShock was one of the first. I stand to be corrected, but I think
the meta type.
No, whereby you have a core narrative, but if you took the time to find the audio logs, you would know more about Atlas from the original game than before when you get to the end and he's like, may you be so kind or whatever if you please, right?
Yeah, if you please.
So what I mean by that is the BioShock series, it's not narratively perfect by any means, but they always did a very good job of giving you more than enough from the core narrative. However, if you found the extra little tidbits along the way, it would flesh it out so much more.
Yes.
And I think
and then
that's what you're getting at, right? Because I remember so much. Infinite was just incredible. I loved the story, the timey-wimey stuff, etc., etc. And like you said, it answered things you never needed to answer, but also at the same time, picking up those audio logs along the way fleshed it out so much more. But even if you missed out on all the audio logs, you still enjoyed an incredible narrative.
That's the thing, because no matter if you miss 4 audio logs until you get to the main to the end or whatever, each and every audio log you get always is also self-contained. It gives you a little bit of lore without giving you questions.
Yes, precisely.
Which is amazing.
Precisely. So I mean, have we answered how important are narrative lore elements to video games? I would say
yes.
I think we have answered it enough because, as we said, it's nuanced, depends on the genre, it depends on the gameplay, it depends on the style. I think the issue is that we need to stop giving games that push a narrative a pass when exploration is required to flesh out the narrative because there are narrative pieces missing.
Exactly.
That is, I think, the crux of this discussion, is that there's nothing wrong with the narrative, but if you're going to do a narrative, you do it properly, you do it wholly, so that there aren't so many questions left on the floor that can only be answered by external media or media within the game that needs to be found. Because doing so means that your narrative is then never complete, and an incomplete narrative eventually becomes unfulfilling. Because then along the way, especially with sequels, you will come to wonder what happened there. When did this happen? This is strange. Who's this?
It gives you too much questions.
Yes.
I think the big thing is having a question or two is always good because it makes you want more.
And wanting more is always a good thing. That's what sequels are for.
But you shouldn't be asking questions about what already transpired and why it transpired.
That's exactly it. Yeah. Well, we would also love to know, what do you think? What do you think, our listeners and viewers, of lore and narratives in video games? Do you agree with what we say about it? Or do you not care? Or maybe you care a lot. Are you somebody who only plays narrative-focused video games? Or alternatively, are you somebody who couldn't care less about the narrative? Let us know, because video games are a very interesting medium. As we've said before, the fact that they're interactive gives them so much more nuance in terms of what is possible with the narrative versus something like movies or TV series. So, yeah, would love to hear what all of you have to say about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is the end of episode 81. Yeah.
Was a good one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it thoroughly.
We maybe went like a little bit all over the show, a little bit kind of like a bad narrative,
or a very good one,
but somewhere
Depends.
along the way we have the little tidbits here and there. Yeah, it's just an interesting thing to me. And personally speaking, from my perspective, I'm a narrative person. I gravitate towards games that have a much better narrative than those that don't. But of course, again, it depends on the game. So if it's a game where you can create your own narrative, like something like RimWorld, that's also a lot of fun. But that's not what we're talking about here, because that's create your own adventure thing like The Sims and so on and so forth. Or even Jurassic World Evolution 2, they're different style games, right? But I mean, if you're going to give me a incredible story to get involved in, I don't mind doing the whole lore searching thing, but it shouldn't be to the point where I have to now go to external media or I have to find audio logs or whatever the case is. Otherwise, the story is incomplete. That's all I want to say about that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Alrighty then. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you like what we do, your support will be greatly appreciated. So, like, subscribe, etc., etc. And more importantly, share these discussions if you enjoy them, and also talk to us. Comment below.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to tell us we're wrong.
Yeah, that too.
We'll just argue with you online. It's fine.
Either way, thank you once again for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you all again on the next episode. So until then, bye.
Bye.